Strategy History by Lawrence Friedman, Oxford Press, 2013, page 78, Borodino. Borodino was a battle that was neither an exemplary success nor a total defeat, notable defeat, but acquired importance because it raised doubts about Napoleon's method. The Battle of Borodino, some 80 miles from Moscow, was fateful in its consequences. Fought between the French and Russian armies on September 7, 1812, it involved some 250,000 men. Of these, about 75,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. Although the French came out on top, the Russians did not consider themselves beaten. Moscow was occupied following Borodino, but the Russians refused to agree to peace terms, and Napoleon found that he lacked the capacity to sustain his army for any length of time. After 5 weeks, he began the famous and harsh retreat from Moscow. It was not that Napoleon lacked a strategy when he began a campaign in the summer of 1812. He expected to follow his past practice of keeping the enemy guessing, finding a point to concentrate overwhelming superiority, and then attacking. Once Russian forces were destroyed, he could dictate peace terms to Tsar Alexander. To keep the war short and avoid being sucked into the Russian heartland, he wanted to fight his battle in the frontier regions. He was confident against Russian armies, since he boasted such stunning victories as Austerlitz in 1805. Russian leadership had generally been abysmal, and Napoleon assumed that the spineless aristocracy would oblige the Tsar to concede once French superiority had been made clear. Tsar Alexander had a far better, although politically controversial, strategy. It drew on Russia's excellent intelligence network in France. Alexander knew from 1810 that a war was almost inevitable. This gave him time to think about a response and to make preparations, taking a candid view of Russia's weakness, including a lack of reliable allies. One option was to fight at the first opportunity before the French could advance far on sacred Russian soil, relying on the superior spirit of Russian troops and what might be achieved by catching the French by surprise. But Alexander knew the numbers were against him and saw the danger in pitting his main armies without reserves against a well-supplied and fully formed French army. A defeat would leave the country unprotected. This led him into a defensive strategy, although this meant giving up on an alliance. Austria and Prussia were reluctant to join an anti-French coalition involving a Russia that planned to retreat, but Alexander doubted that he could rely on them even if he embarked on an offensive strategy. Most importantly, he understood that Napoleon wanted battle. If that was what he wanted, that was exactly what he should not have. The Russian plan, therefore, was to fall back, and to the chagrin of many senior officers whose instincts were offensive. By trading space for time, they would gain strength. As the French advanced away from their supply lines, the Russians would get closer to theirs. Since Napoleon's system depended on big battles and rapid victories, the Russians would retreat, raid enemy communications with their much superior light cavalry, and wear down Napoleon's forces. We must avoid big battles until we have fallen right back to our supply lines. Quote unquote. The Russians knew what they needed to do, but they had no actual plan of retreat. That depended on when and how Napoleon made his first move. When it came, the retreat had a degree of improvisation, but it was managed better than Napoleon's advance. The emperor was prepared for an early battle, but not for a long advance into unforgiving terrain in the face of inclement weather. As Napoleon chased the Russians in search of a battle, he exhausted his men, and particularly his horses. Only as he got close to Moscow could he be confident that he would at last get his battle. Despite his tired and depleted force, Napoleon stuck with his original plan on the assumption that the Russians would not give up Moscow without a fight. Facing him in charge of the Russian forces was General Mikhail Kutuzov, the shrewd officer with a good understanding of the attitudes of ordinary soldiers and the Russian people, as well as considerable experience in war. But Kutuzov was now 65, physically and mentally slower than before, and surrounded by flatterers. When the battle came, his deployments and command arrangements were haphazard. He delegated his powers of command to subordinate generals to act as they saw fit in the circumstances. His passivity left the impression that he had no idea what was going on or what to do next. Yet the revelation at Borodino was how much Napoleon was off form and off maxim. The advance into Russia had been unexpectedly challenging and costly in men and materiel. By the time of the battle, the Grand Armée had already lost a third of its original 450,000 men. without a proper fight. Although much is made of the terrible impact of the Russian winter on the retreat from Moscow, the initial and critical damage was done by the Russian summer. The Russians enjoyed a notional numerical advantage at the time of the battle, although this evaporated when some 31,000 Russian militiamen, without much by way of weapons or training, were subtracted, leaving around 130,000 French facing 125,000 Russians. The emperor himself had put on fat, having enjoyed the good life to excess, and had lost the energy of his earlier years. On the day of the battle he also was unwell, suffering from fever and a painful inability to urinate. He barely seemed in charge. Napoleon's subordinate generals conducted the battle almost independently of each other, and without the cohesion he would once have imposed. Instead of his forces being committed against one particular line of attack, there were a series of uncoordinated probes against the Russian positions. Although his superior firepower blasted holes in the Russian defenses, the enemy fought doggedly and did not surrender, much to Napoleon's consternation. When breakthroughs were possible, he dithered, bothered by practicalities when bold maneuvers were proposed to him. With little left of his army to spare at a critical moment, he held back the Imperial Guard out of concern that he would have little left for his next battle. In past battles he had been in evident presence, riding around to make his own assessments of the situation at the front and to enthuse his troops. On this day he was absent. A French officer, observing the emperor's indecision in the face of contradictory reports about Russian strength, described Napoleon's, quote, suffering and dejected face, his features sunken and a dull look, giving his orders languishingly, in the midst of these dreadful warlike noises to which he seemed completely a stranger, end quote. Uncategorized adds that Napoleon was unrecognizable, and his lethargy may have been the most decisive factor in the battle, as he rejected proposals that could have delivered victory. The emperor took comfort in the fact that at the end of the day he occupied the battlefield and had inflicted greater harm on the enemy than his own forces had suffered. But the Russian army was not annihilated, and those that were not killed or wounded largely escaped. Napoleon had expected to take many prisoners, but the actual haul was small. He now lacked the capacity to finish the Russians off in another battle. A large country with a large population could absorb the losses. Kutuzov managed to withdraw his forces in an orderly fashion. His one important, absolutely critical decision was to encourage Napoleon to enter Moscow instead of chasing his army in order to inflict what might have been a decisive defeat. This had not been his original intent. Prior to Borodino, he had resisted the idea that Moscow was just another town that might have to be sacrificed for the greater good of saving the Russian Empire. Now Kutuzov acknowledged that he could not save both Moscow and the army, and that if the army was lost, then Moscow would go anyway. Napoleon, he observed, is like a torrent which we are still too weak to stem. Moscow is the sponge which we will suck him in. Napoleon allowed himself to be sucked in. As the city was being occupied, fires began and ultimately destroyed 2/3 of it. Napoleon expected the Tsar to sue for peace. Soon he realized that with the Russians unwilling to either fight another battle or negotiate a settlement, he was stranded, unable to sustain his forces through hunger and cold. He had no choice but to return to France. The journey home was bitter and crippling. When the Russians eventually advanced, the Tsar was able to realize the ultimate goal of his own strategy, which was to revive the anti-Napoleon coalition in Europe. After this debacle and a first exile, Napoleon made one further attempt at glory, which came to grief at Waterloo in 1815. This master of war had been defeated, and those writing the textbooks were left to ponder not only the sources of his original success, but the causes of his ultimate failure. For present during the Russian campaign, though playing minor roles, were the two greatest 19th century theorists of war, Karl von Clausewitz and Baron Antoine Henri de Jomini.